Hello, Gene Schwimmer here. Welcome to today's vlog. You'll notice, I'm sure, that the background is green. That's to differentiate it from what you're going to see going forward, which will be against a gray background. That's because what you're going to see is part 2 of 2 parts. I recorded a vlog last week. It turned out to be so long that after I started editing it, I decided that I should break it into 2 parts. So I'm just letting you know, as for part 1, I'm putting a link in the description. And there should also be, if I do it right, at the end of this vlog, there would also be, they sometimes show those 3 little thumbnails of other vlogs. I'm gonna put that in there too, a thumbnail with a link. Anyways, part 1 was, well, you'll have to watch part 1. It was about the Maricopa County audit, about objections that had been raised by a commenter. I was replying to the commenter. Now in this part, I am showing actual videos from the Maricopa County Senate hearing. So if you don't need to see those actual videos, then you really don't need to watch this vlog, because that's what the whole video is going to be. Just wanted to give everybody a heads up, and now here is part 2. And now I'm going to go to these detailed videos. So if you don't think you need to see the videos, then this is another point where you could just stop and just turn off the video. But if you want to see it, and again, I really highly recommend watching the entire video, and I'm linking to it again in the description. But let's start with Ken Bennett, the liaison, talking about duplicate ballots and about looking at physical ballots. And I have to just jump back to Scott for a moment, because he said something about, you've just spent months counting the ballots. First of all, Maricopa County, they didn't spend any time counting the ballots, if you mean all the ballots. They only counted a sample. But just counting ballots, a mere count of ballots without, for example, this should be very simple, determining that a duplicate ballot has an original against which to be matched. If you're not even going to do something as simple as that, then how can you call it an audit? It's not an audit, it's a mere count, and counting counterfeit ballots and duplicate ballots that are not duplicate ballots, or multiple ballots, or 20 ballots that come from the same address, from a little house that has officially 2 people living in it, and 20 ballots come from that address. That would just seem to indicate to me that just counting those kind of ballots, you're not really doing an audit. And that's one of the highlights of what you're about to see, how thorough these auditors are compared to how sloppy the Maricopa County auditors were, the ones that Maricopa County hired, not to mention the sloppiness of this election. Because even if we assume that there was no foul play, this is so incompetent and so sloppy that, in my opinion, and I think many of you will agree with me, you just cannot trust the results. So here is Bennett. Watch.
I can find no election procedures manual directives or state law that says you have to put them in the boxes in this specific way, but that may be something that we need to look at.
Anything else that you want to add at this point? We'll
only other thing,
come back with you if you do need.
Yeah, the only other thing I guess that I was personally involved in on a couple of, not the only other thing, but an other thing that I was called to one of the counting tables is when we started opening duplicate ballots. There was almost one whole pallet of ballots that were called original/damaged ballots sent to duplication. And then there was quite a few boxes, mostly on one pallet, but scattered amongst 3 or 4 other pallets, where the duplicates were supposedly there for the duplicates that were sent to duplication. So if a ballot gets damaged and has to be sent to duplication, there is a very specific process in the Election Procedures Manual. Chapter 10, Roman numeral 2, Section 3, procedures for duplicating a ballot. This stems precisely from ARS 16621A, which says that they are to record an identical serial number on both the original and duplicate ballot, including spoiled duplicates. This ties the ballots together and creates a paper trail as required by the statute ARS 16621A. We found, I would have to say, thousands of duplicate ballots where those serial numbers are not on them. And so it has created great difficulty to try to match up a duplicated ballot to its duplicate. And on thousands of the ones that a serial number was put on, they were put on by a, I guess you would call it like a dot matrix printer, very, very light. And unfortunately, they ended up being printed on the ballot on the top, usually top right part of the ballot, where the black square alignment marks are on the ballot. And so if a very light gray number is printed on little black boxes that are a quarter of an inch apart, you see one number and you miss the next, and you see the number and you miss two, and it made for some very difficult matching of duplicated ballots and their duplicates, which, as I just read to you, one of the most important things you need to do when you duplicate ballots is reflect a serial number on both the duplicate and the duplicated, so that you can do two main things. One, make sure you have one for every one of the other, and two, make sure that you can look at the votes reflected on the duplicated ballot and make sure that they reflected those correctly from the ballot that was damaged and was duplicated. So without those serial numbers, it gets very difficult. We found some nice bright red serial numbers on many, but some very difficult to deal with light black numbers on many others, and none whatsoever on many others.
If the corresponding numbers aren't on there, how would you know whether it was duplicated once or 10 times?
You wouldn't.
Okay, thank you.
Unless you meticulously kept track of the total number in each group, which I think Doug's organization has done,
Okay.
to see if the totals match at least.
You said that when we return these ballots, I'm hoping that you guys and will help make sure that they are given to the Arizona County Treasurer. It's my understanding that...
Maricopa County Treasurer.
Right, the Maricopa County Treasurer. It's my understanding that our statutes say that they're supposed to be turned over to the Treasurer at a certain point, and they were not. Are you well aware of that as well?
Yes.
Yes, okay. When we return those, you mentioned that you were going to put tamper evidence tape with a numbered seal on that.
Mm-hmm.
You also mentioned that everything you have done, you have put back in order.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned everything has been filmed with all of these petabytes of stuff. So if anybody opens those boxes, we will know that somebody has opened those boxes. And everything that you have just said, and if anybody needs to see that themselves upon court order or whatever, we will be able to not only view that on film, video, but we could also go to the physical evidence and break that seal, hopefully under court order, and go directly to exactly where you have said this has happened. Is that correct?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Welcome back. Now we go to Ben Cotton. We're going to be with Ben Cotton for a while. We start off with Ben Cotton walking us through the steps that they took to maintain an irrefutable chain of custody. Here is Ben Cotton.
Through that process a bit to help everyone understand the forensics fidelity and the standard of care that we took to ensure that there were zero, and I repeat, zero changes to any of the original media or devices.
Okay, go ahead.
So as part of the imaging process, first of all, chain of custody is extremely important, as we previously discussed with the ballots. That standard of care also was transferred into the digital imaging and preservation of that data. So upon receiving each of these digital devices, we filled out an evidence acquisition form that started the initial chain of custody for the acquisition within the digital forensics and analysis piece of this audit. On that form, we carefully recorded all of the serial numbers. We then leveraged what is known in the industry as a write block device. Now, a write block device is used, and as a matter of fact...
How is write spelled?
So write, W-R-I-T-E.
Right, as in write.
As
okay.
in write.
Okay.
And the sole purpose of this device is to prevent any modification of the original evidence that is plugged into it. Okay. This is accepted within our judicial system as the methodology needed to be utilized for anything to be admitted into court and to maintain that standard of care for the digital forensics chain of custody. As part of that acquisition, we then took a bit-for-bit copy, forensics copy, of each of the digital devices. At the end of that copy, we applied what is known as a MD5, a Machine Digest 5 hash value to that acquisition. Now, when you think about that, it is a digital fingerprint of that evidence that we just acquired. If anyone changes even one bit of data within that evidence file, it will totally invalidate the MD5 and create a totally new signature on that particular piece of evidence. Okay? So for every device that Mr. Bennett mentioned that we imaged, we performed that exact process. We know who imaged it, we know when they imaged it, we know where it was imaged to, and that is a controlled item within our evidence and chain of custody handling procedure. We then took those digital copies and we maintained one of those digital copies as primary evidence. And so we locked that away in a U.S. government GSA approved safe to ensure that no one would access it and that it is there as the primary evidence for the basis of our analysis. We then created examination copies that we have used for the determination of the cybersecurity status and other aspects of those systems. Okay. So I must reiterate, not a single bit of data was ever changed on any device that came into our possession.
So, Madam President, Mr. Cotton, are you saying that the machines were not damaged or tampered with in any way where they couldn't be used again? And if they were, you have implemented the, people could check and see whether that was done?
Senator, that is correct. So we have exactly a bit-for-bit image of these systems as we received them. Okay, we did not modify, we did not change any chips, we did not access any anything other than the hard drives for those systems. So if there were any changes to the original equipment, those had to have occurred within the custody of the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors, not with the custody of the auditors.
Okay.
I'd like to also reiterate that as part of our evidence handling procedure, we had cameras watching over our evidence storage facilities and our acquisition and replication procedures 24/7. Okay? So any form of tampering certainly would have been caught on video. However, we did not do anything of the sort that would have interfered with any of the machine configurations or any of the allegated tampering that the Secretary of State has alleged.
So, Madam President, if I may, just
Welcome back, and I defy the Maricopa County officials and the liberals supporting them to show that their maintenance, their policies, their procedures for maintaining a chain of custody were even remotely as thorough as Ben Cotton's was. Now, continuing with Ben Cotton, here is his list of items that were requested and given to Ben Cotton, to the digital forensic auditors, the Cypher people, and a list of what he needs that was not given.
Can you continue to just tell us with what you've received, what have you received, and what has been done with what you've received so far?
So Mr. Bennett went through the list of devices that we have received. I would add to that list that he...
Could you just repeat it real quick, just so we
Sure.
kind of
So we have-
compartmentalize it with the digital forensics?
We have received 385 tabulators.
Okay.
Okay, those are the Dominion ICP2s. We have received the county EMS server. EMS, once again, is the election management system. We received their server. We received physical devices correlating to the EMS workstation function, to the adjudication function. We have received 11 hard drives that contained cloned images of various other systems within the EMS ecosystem/network. Of interesting note, however, is on those 11 hard drives which contain cloned data, they did not use a forensically secure process to image those original systems. So the dates and times on those cloned systems were altered by their cloning process. So just as an FYI. With all of the digital devices that we have received, whether in physical or digital form, we have created a forensic copy of each one of those devices as prescribed in the procedures that I just outlined to you. Okay. We have taken those digital forensics copies and we have conducted keyword searching across them, looking for internet connections, looking for anomalous or unauthorized connections into the system. We have conducted searches looking for malware on those systems. We have also created virtual systems of those forensics images to conduct live memory analysis on those virtual systems. And that's where we are today.
So what have we not received from the county that we were supposed to get to be able to do the forensic analysis of?
I think if I'm going to put these in order of criticality, we have not received the router configuration files. We have not received the router data. And Mr. Bennett and myself were in multiple conversations with county officials in which they had agreed to provide that information to us. We had actually entered into a compromise with the county in which they would provide us with virtual access to that data, in addition to providing us with Splunk NetFlow data with a time period of approximately 90 days prior to the election and 60 days after the election. And we had agreed to that. We have not received that due to a response from the county in May stating that they would not provide that because the data would compromise law enforcement operations and would also potentially compromise PII information of Maricopa County residents that had not already been turned over as part of the audit request.
Now here is Ben Cotton talking about the routers and about the breach that Scott implies never happened. So now you can hear and see this specific testimony regarding the breach and the routers from Ben Cotton, the digital forensic auditor.
Okay, now tell us the significance of us not, why do you need to look at the routers and the router data and the Splunk logs that they originally told us they were going to give us, and now they have, they're not going to provide that, or they're saying they won't provide that. What's the significance? Why do we need to look at that?
Well, it's critically important to substantiate some findings that we are seeing through the keyword searching and the processes I've already mentioned. There are a number of things that we know as a matter of fact have occurred that we need to further take that information and validate that information. So, for example, we know through public record, public statements, that an element of the election system was actually compromised or breached during the course of the November 2020 election. It is a matter of public statement by Maricopa County, as well as legal action and law enforcement action surrounding that particular incident. The registration server that was public facing did have unauthorized access to that. In cybersecurity terms, it was breached. We know that the county has accepted that as an unauthorized breach because they actually issued a letter to a small subset of the voters who were affected by that breach, and they issued that in January of 2021. In that letter, they did acknowledge that there was unauthorized access in November to that server. Okay, so that's one item. The second item is it has become readily apparent in the course of our analysis that there are severe cybersecurity problems with the way the election management system and network was maintained. Okay. For example,
if you can give us
for
some
example,
examples of that.
if you walk into an average home computer, you will find that the antivirus definitions that protect that system from malware have been updated within the last week. You will find that there have been system security patches sent by Microsoft or by Apple, typically within the last week. Microsoft does it weekly. And you would find that that system is patched and the antivirus definitions are up to date. Sadly, that is not the case for any of the endpoints that we have looked at inside of the Maricopa County election management system. Okay? The last time that the antivirus was updated on these systems was the date that the Dominion software was installed on the systems. That happens to be August of 2019. Okay. There have been no operating system updates or patches on this system since that same date. What that creates is a tremendous vulnerability to anyone who could get access through a system such as if, for example, the registration server was serving as a jump box. In other words, it was dual network so that it was public facing and also private facing into the election system. If someone accessed that system, they would have no difficulty at all effectively penetrating and gaining system level access at the current patch state and antivirus state of these systems.
So, Madam President, Mr. Cotton, if they could have if they were able to get access, how long would it take somebody to hack in or whatever if they're?
The vulnerabilities that exist on these systems would take an average script kiddie less than 10 minutes to get access to these systems.
Okay, so this is high vulnerability situations. So we need to get the routers. It's clear we need to get the routers. We need, even if it's just a report, they can scan it, they can look at it, they can do whatever they need to do to make it safe. We just need to see the traffic during this election or during this period that you're looking for. Now they brought up security concerns. Are these, do you believe these are valid concerns that they brought up from sharing the router traffic or router reports with us? Anything from the router? Are these valid security concerns from your point of view?
They're not. And let me explain why. So when you think about a router, think about someone delivering the mail to your mailbox, okay? That router is simply the mail carrier, okay? On a standard envelope that you might mail to your mother, you're going to put your return address, you're going to put the address that it's going to, and then you put that in the mailbox. The mail carrier looks at that, it knows they know where to route that, and they will simply route that letter so it's delivered in the mailbox of your mother. With a router, it's very similar. For each packet of data that you have an address to where it's going to, you have an address of where it came from, so that any response can come right back to that system. But what you don't have is the actual content or the letter that's contained in the envelope within the router itself.
Okay, so just to that point, you won't see social security numbers or driver's licenses or people-sensitive data on this.
You will not.
Okay.
To that point, Senator Peterson? Yes. So when we're talking about the addresses, is this what is known as the IP addresses? Am I on the right track on this?
Yes, ma'am. So it's actually a combination of two elements. One is the IP address, which everyone's very familiar with. But typically on the return side, you will also have what's known as a MAC address. And that is a unique identifier for the communicating device that actually sent the packet. Okay, so for example, if you've got a wireless phone, your wireless modem has a unique MAC address, so that if you're behind a home router or something like that, it will know where to deliver that return packet to.
Okay. One of my concerns, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Please. When we received the letter from Sheriff Penzone stating that we would not get the routers because of a potential security issue, the one thing that stuck in my mind, I just heard you say that there is not a valid security concern there, but just hypothetically, if for some reason they think that there's a security concern, my question is why would they be using the same router as our election systems, if there's even a small remote possibility that they think that somebody could be jeopardized? Why are we sharing routers with other agencies? Why don't they have their own personal secure router?
Ma'am, I can't answer why they shared that space, but once again, this is one of those situations where what they've told the public is drastically different than the apparent reality in response to a legal subpoena. Okay, so from a public response standpoint, Maricopa County officials have repeatedly stated that the election system was a closed system, it did not touch the internet, and therefore, it could not have commingled with the data from the Sheriff's Department or the Maricopa County other office space. The fact that they have responded back to an official subpoena with the justification that to produce that data would compromise these other aspects of the Maricopa County network that does touch the internet is an admission that maybe things aren't like what they've told the American public.
Welcome back. Now here is another conversation between the other Republican on the panel. That would be Warren Peterson and again Ben Cotton, talking about Splunk logs. If you want to know what a Splunk log is, if you've always wondered, now you're going to find out. And you're also going to learn about passwords. Here's the video.
So, Mr. Cotton, we've talked about the routers, Splunk logs. Again, why do we need the Splunk logs? And I also want to ask about that. We also, you mentioned, have not received the passwords, the tokens. Why do we need those things?
So if I can
To the
address
machine.
the first part of that question, Senator Peterson. So part of the challenge that we have is that specifically, I'll use the EMS server as an example. The Windows security log, or the Windows security event log, as some people would call that, actually only goes back to the 5th of February of 2021. Now, there are a couple of things
So after the election.
after the election.
Okay.
So we would need this data to cover and to help fill in the blanks back to the election, okay? But more importantly, there's an aspect to that security log that bears consideration. And so the security log was set to retain approximately 20 megabytes of data. And the way that works is it operates on a first in, first out principle. As soon as you hit 20 megabytes of data, the oldest entry gets deleted, and the next, and so it just continually rolls like that to maintain the constraints on on that data space. When we took a look at this, we found specifically in March, and I believe it was March 11th, there were 37,646 queries for a blank password on a system that only contained 8 accounts. Now, given the short time period that happened, that clearly was a script that was executed by the user EMS admin. Okay. What we don't have, because of the lack of logs and the condition of that system, is where did that script come from? Okay. So by leveraging the router information and by leveraging the Splunk information, I should be able to determine who was using the EMS admin account at that particular time and where did that originate from.
So just to be clear on this, were there 37,000 logins on one day? Is that what you're saying? How would you identify this?
When you're doing a security check on a system, it's very common for you to look for passwords that have a null password or a blank password, right? And so you can query the device itself to let you know whether or not there are any accounts that have a blank password on them.
So it's a query? I'm just looking for what you're calling this.
It's a script, it's a query.
So there's 37,000 queries.
Yes.
And they were done on this one day. And the reason we need the Splunk logs is because those 37,000 queries churned the data so that you can only look back to February 5th, or what was the date?
February 5th.
February 5th.
That is correct.
And obviously, we need to go back to the election.
Right.
We need to be looking at the election day, prior to the election day, looking at access. So we don't have that, what we were given, we don't have that, that window, which is the critical window we need to look at.
That is correct.
Okay. So obviously, we need the routers, or just the data, and how about we just start with March 11th, the 37,000 queries? I mean, give us something here. What about the machines, the Dominion machines, the tokens for the machines? Why do we need those?
Okay. So within the administrative functions of the Dominion ICPs, you have basically a couple of different levels or roles, as they call them, inside of the EMS software. The current state, so we have completely recreated a virtual EMS. I am able to burn these little fobs or iButton keys, as they really are, and those give me security access at whatever role I'm permitted to burn inside of the EMS. Currently, inside of the EMS construct, there is only one role, and that is of poll worker. Within the Dominion ICPs, poll workers as a role, even if you give them admin access, do not get access to the configuration of that device itself. So on each of these ICPs, and these are ICP2s, we know that there are 2 NIC cards. We know that they can be configured with wireless modems. We know that they can be configured with cellular modems. So the purpose of requiring this information is to get a configuration for each of those systems that shows how they were configured, what is enabled, what is not enabled, and more importantly, I can get the MAC addresses for each of those devices. Now, if you recall our previous conversation on the router data, where you have an IP address, you have a MAC address. It then becomes a very simple process to say, did any of these MAC addresses ever touch the internet? It's very simple.
So it sounds like Maricopa County does not have access to this. Dominion only has access to this. Why is it important for Maricopa County to be able to have access to this?
Well, your assumption appears to be true. So when we asked them for the administration level fobs, we received a response back to the same, within the same letter as the router data, saying that they had provided us everything that they have access to, and the inference obviously there is that only the contract Dominion employees, contracted by Maricopa County, have access to configure those ICPs and to get access to the configuration or technician aspects of those ICPs. Now, where this becomes important is that if you as a county cannot validate the configuration independently of the vendor, then how do you ever validate an election system that it's safe to vote? Okay? Because you don't know. As a county, it's responsible to validate and certify those systems prior to a vote. Okay? So I would suggest that at this point, based on the evidence that has been provided to me, that the Maricopa County officials do not have the ability to independently verify the configurations of their systems without using Dominion employees.
Welcome back, and now here is that conversation that I referred to earlier between President of the Senate, Karen Fann, and Ben Cotton, the digital forensics expert, about how Maricopa County, their auditors could have missed so much. Here's the video.
Question? And I don't know that you have an answer, but I'm going to throw it out and maybe we can put it on our list of questions to ask. Originally, the Board of Supervisors had agreed to do a forensic audit with us, which is what we wanted. We did not want the ballots moved. We would not want the machines moved. And that's the path I thought we were going on until they went into an executive session and said they were going to do their own audits using 2 companies that are authorized to certify the machines. And so they did these 2 audits. One was Pro V&V, one was SLI. Thank you. those two. If they had done the audit, as Senator Peterson said, why did they not come up with this information and report it as well? I don't know that you'd have an answer. It's
Probably can't speak for their
I can't speak to what their scoping was. I would suspect that a full cybersecurity audit was not part of their scoping. That's what I would surmise. But the reports that were produced by both of those audit firms clearly did not address the cybersecurity aspects that we have found. And there's another finding that you would think that any audit firm would be looking at, and that is commonality of passwords. So what we have found is that for all the administrative accounts, no matter what the name of that account was, they shared the same password. Okay? Now, that password appears to have been established at the same time that the Dominion software was installed on these systems, which August of 2019, and does not appear to have been changed during that entire time period. Okay. So once again,
And so to that point, what would be the what would be the recommendations with, what's the industry standard with passwords and recommendations with password, best practices with that?
well, first and foremost, the shared password eliminates one of the very critical items of cybersecurity, and that is we cannot attribute the actions of a given username back to an individual. Because these were all shared passwords, literally anyone who had any access to any admin account could have been able to use any other admin account. So accountability is out the window, right, from an individual aspect. From a cybersecurity standpoint, it is
Now, just to be clear, when we're talking about these passwords, these are the passwords for the server. This is not the machine admin password you're talking. Which passwords are you talking about here?
We're talking about the EMS admin password. We're talking about the adjudication admin password.
So this is not the Dominion machine,
Operating system password.
This is the EMS, meaning the election servers, not
So-
the Dominion tabulators or machine.
There is a correlation between the Dominion Windows accounts and the Dominion functions. So you can't separate the two. In other words, when you log into the EMS server, for example, you will enter in the EMS admin username, and then you'll enter in a password. Okay, that provides you single sign-on access into all of the functions of the EMS software. So these two things are tied together.
Right, but what I'm trying to make sure that's clear for people to understand is that you do have the admin password for the server, correct?
Correct.
But you don't have the admin password for the tokens for the Dominion machines.
A little bit of a correction there. I do have the admin passwords. What I don't have is the authentication fob because it requires both of those items.
Right.
So we were able to recover the admin passwords used for the tabulators, but because we don't have the ability to burn that iButton fob.
It's like an additional layer of
Correct.
security.
It's a multi-factor
for
authentication
those.
into the tabulator.
And it appears that only Dominion has that.
Correct.
From what we know so far.
Correct.
From the information we have so far. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Madam
right,
President.
anything else?
Welcome back. And now here is a question to Ben Cotton, simply to mention anything that hadn't been mentioned up to that point that he thought should be mentioned.
I think that there is one other critical aspect of why I need the Splunk logs. So anonymous logins are a normal part of Windows activity. So if you've ever accessed a shared file in Windows, that's called an SMB share. And as part of that request, there will be an anonymous logon action to the server that has the share file on it. And then that is followed immediately by the authentication of the user that is requesting that access. As part of that, the course of that normal anonymous action, the Windows logs will actually record the username that is requesting that action. It will record the IP address that is originating the request, and it will record the host name of that originating client. What we are seeing here, and what does require additional correlation with NetFlow data, is we're seeing anonymous logins at the system level that do not follow that pattern of normal Windows behavior, okay? And so we need to have that additional data to validate what that activity is.
Welcome back. That takes care of Ben Cotton. Now we go on to Ken Logan, the CEO of the Cyber Ninjas. Here he is talking about, first of all, the lack of cooperation, how this is so unique that in every audit he's done up until this one, he gets cooperation from the people being audited. This is the first time that he's not getting cooperation. And he also talks about duplicate ballot problems with exhibits. So I would invite the liberals and Scott, if they think those exhibits are false, to prove it. And if they can't prove it, then to address what those exhibits show. And here is Doug Logan.
We would like you to help us address the issues that you're having with the hand counting of ballots, the paper examination, and then we'll move into voter data analysis and envelopes. So let's start with the hand count of ballots and where we're at on that.
So yeah, so there's been a lot of questions, I know, about the timeline and why some things have taken a little bit longer than expected. I have to say that every audit I've ever been a part of, usually whatever the organization is that you're working with, is available to answer questions or run ideas by and to get some feedback on findings. And that's one of the more difficult things with this audit is to not have that feedback loop and not be able to ask questions on things that could be solved very quickly.
From Maricopa County.
Correct, from Maricopa County. Specifically, we've run into with I think Ken Bennett was stating earlier about some of the duplicated ballots. Specifically, we've had a lot of problems with the way that those were recorded and the way they were received over. I think probably the best way to do this is to go over, I think it's actually Exhibit B, if you can put that up on the screen. Is it the photo? Actually, can you zoom in so people can see that a little better? Okay. So what we have here on the top of the screen is the original manifest on one of the boxes that held duplicate stuff in it. You can see all the numbers, the MC17416 and so forth. So that was what was stated was given to us. If you take a look at the table below it, and actually if you can just zoom in a little more maybe to make it a little more clear. And we don't need the top part anymore, you can scroll down. So on the actual manifest, the far left column has the manifest batch number. And then if you look right next to it, there's actually what the observed batch number was within it. You'll notice that the first few ones are actually correct. But then you get down to MC171634, which is about halfway down. You notice that its naming convention is as if it is an original, but it is actually a duplicate. And just to step back a little bit to give a little bit of clarity, anytime there is a ballot that can't be run through the tabulator, whether that's because it's damaged, whether it's because it's something like a Braille ballot or something like UACAVA, any of the other forms, they actually have to create duplicates of it that are then run through the tabulators.
Can you tell us what UACAVA stands for, please?
Uniform Overseas Citizen Absentee Voter Act.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. In any case, so you have the original ballots, and then you have the duplicates, and there was roughly 50,000 total, so there's 25,000 originals and roughly 25,000 duplicates, assuming that they all matched up with that. So in order to make sure that things are not double counted and things are attributed properly, it's very important to be able to match them up. In fact, this is why there's statute that says there's supposed to be a serial number on the original that you can match up with the serial number, on the actual duplicate. So one for one that they were counted properly. And from an audit standpoint, we want to make sure that the original is exactly the same as the duplicate. So it's important to us to make sure that we can match those. So when we receive a manifest that states that stuffs were originals, when we actually start looking through them, we realize that they're duplicates. It creates things that are a lot more complicated and difficult for us. So these are some of the examples in here. You'll see that there's a whole bunch of things that were wrong where we were stated. There's several things on there that were not listed on the manifest that were actually in the box. There's one of them that was actually on the box that wasn't really in the that was on the manifest that wasn't actually found in the box. We had within the Braille ballot box that was labeled as Braille ballot, we had other types of ballots that were found in there that were not expected to be in there. So it makes things much more difficult. And moving on to, actually, if you scroll down, you should see Exhibit C. Okay.
You might need to speak into the mic a little bit more,
I'm sorry.
Mr. Logan.
So what we have here is we actually took a few examples out where serial numbers really should be unique. There should be one original ballot with a serial number and one ballot which is the duplicate of it with the same serial number. When you take a look at this chart, the first column is the box ID. That's the box that it came out of. And then you take a look at the next column, it'll tell you whether it's a type, what the type is. Dupe means it's a duplicate. DSD, it means that it's actually the original ballot. And you'll notice that the last column is a serial number, but they're in groups of 3, which shouldn't really happen. So we have 2 original ballots that have the same exact serial number, and we have only one that was duplicated from it. And these are just a handful of examples that we have that go through it. And so we have a whole bunch of ballots that also don't have any serial number of them, so it's quite possible that for the second one with the same serial number, there's another one that matches up with it that literally doesn't have a serial number on it. But it creates a lot of time and difficulty in resolving these issues when it was not done in a manner where it's easy to match up and really according to my understanding of what statute it is and what statute states. Not an attorney, but Ken Bennett can probably speak a lot more about
I'm not one either.
But you know the statutes really well.
So just to be clear on this, Madam President, I think, so this is some of the delay, I guess, some of why it took so long to put these all together or trying to assimilate this, because you've got this kind of confusion and
Correct.
And with Maricopa County refusing to answer any questions as to help us understand what you did here.
And
right?
there may be some explanation as to how and why serial numbers get duplicated. It doesn't seem like a good practice any way that you look at it, but if it's well documented and there's some easy way for things to be audited, then you're in good shape. But that's one of the problems we've run into, is that so many of the issues we've encountered through things makes it very difficult, if not impossible, in order to audit things. And it's our goal in going through there to give some irrefutable proof to make sure that we know that things were solid or that they're not. And these types of problems make it very difficult for us to be able to say absolutely on certain aspects.
Welcome back, and now here is Doug Logan talking about misalignment, the misalignment issue, a very detailed explanation with exhibits.
Would you like to move on to paper examination issues that you need answers to?
Yes, please. Okay. So we utilized kinematic artifact detection in order to take a look at all of the ballots in order to process to figure out how they work and how they function. And if we can actually get Exhibit D up, please. Go ahead and scroll down. So on every single, I had it mislabeled as E, but it's actually D. Ballots are designed as such so that when you fill out one side of the ballot, it's very important that that if you fill out a bubble, it does happen to bleed through. It doesn't do so in a manner that would actually impact the way the vote was cast. So ballots are designed in the manner to make that so. In order to make sure they're actually aligned, on one side of the ballot, there is the circle and X's that you see in this. And on the other side of the ballot, there's actually printed a cross. And when a ballot is properly aligned, that cross will actually line up perfectly. If you backlight it, this cross will actually line up perfectly. And that's actually the image you're looking at. We have a backlit image of a ballot, and you're seeing in the front side the circle and the cross, and the inside it's very similar to, say, like a gun sight. Now, if you look carefully at that top image, you'll actually notice that it's a little bit offset. Based on standards, that's actually the maximum it's supposed to be offset for a ballot to be viewed as valid and processed, so there aren't any issues with it. If you take a look at that image down at the bottom, you'll notice that it's 1900%. This is actually something from an actual ballot out of Maricopa County that we ran into, where it was out of calibration. And just to give a little bit more perspective, if we scroll down in the PDF to the next section, we actually have 2 batches here. We're still running this process through all the batches, but this graphic, you want to be in the bullseye. The bullseye in the center is actually the check marks on how offset those things should be. And just to be specific, from a calibration standpoint, I think it's supposed to be within 100% of in it, and we made our box about 300%. From the way this is calibrated. And you'll see that the average is actually, take on the top right-hand corner, the average on this is actually 1,024%, and the worst ballot was 3,200%. You can see there's 2 different batches that we have in here as examples. Now,
So, Madam President, Mr. Logan, so what happens to these ballots? What's if this happens, if they're off, the reading off, then what's the result?
Okay,
How is this dealt with in an election?
So if you actually go to the next exhibit, we'll talk through that here. So if they're offset, what it means is if it bleeds through, it can potentially cause an overvote. It can potentially cause you to vote for someone that you intend to vote for, or so forth, because the bleed of one side's bubble can go so forth to the other side and get within the area would be categorized for the other bubble. Now, specifically, we should not have had problems with bleed through. If you scroll down a little bit farther and zoom in where we've got the red box, this is actually a newsletter that was put out by Maricopa County that talks about the paper types that are utilized. And specifically, they state that they use vote secure paper. Now, if vote secure paper is utilized, it's actually a thick paper. It has a special coating on it that helps make sure there isn't bleed through. And so it would help ensure that bleed through wouldn't be a problem, even if things happen to be not perfectly calibrated. But if you scroll down to the next page, we're going to give you an example of an actual ballot where you can see the bleed through that goes through. And you can see that the bleed through is actually very, very close to where votes are cast. Now, as part of additional analysis, we're going to try to get a better idea as to when or if this did impact votes and did impact values. It does require additional analysis in here. But specifically, this is an indication of problems that could cause an overvote situation or could cause votes to be cast for a different candidate than intended.
So let me clarify something. I want to make sure I get this straight, because this was an issue early on, right after the election. So Maricopa County, you're saying on their website, said that they only use secure paper, which does not allow for bleed through. Correct?
Correct. This is actually a newsletter from them, but yes.
Okay, their newsletter. And so if that is correct, there is no way there would be bleed through as what we're seeing on the ballots.
Yeah, based on our discussions with paper experts, they specifically state that paper is thick enough that it wouldn't bleed through, and we are seeing a lot of very thin paper stock being utilized, especially on election day.
Okay. Was this done with, does this happen with just magic markers, or does it happen with ballpoint pens? Do you know that answer? I don't want to put you on the spot, but
I would expect that, with Sharpies, the bleed through would be greater, but it could potentially happen to a lighter amount with regular ballpoint pens as well. Yeah.
Okay. So there was in fact, it was dubbed by some of the media Sharpie Gate at the very beginning, and there were the Maricopa elections people came back and said, no, if there was any bleed through, it would not have affected other votes because it's not lined up. Are you saying that's true or not true?
We would need more analysis, and their final report will be able to tell you more clearly whether this impacted things or not. But definitely, if there was an offset that was in the right direction, the right way, and there was bleed through, it could definitely impact the ballot.
Okay. One more question. Going back to this one on this phase right here, the pictures you had, what would cause that X or that mark to be out of that far of alignment? What causes that?
So if the printer is not properly calibrated, when it prints the second side of the page, it's actually offset, so it's not perfectly aligned. So it could be a number of different things involved, and probably printer calibration would be the key thing for it.
So would this be printer calibration with the people that printed the ballots, the main ballots, and aren't there printers like at the voting sites that they can print?
Yeah.
So it could be any of those printers?
So most of from what I understand, most of the ballots that were printed at Runbeck, that we can confirm with Runbeck, were pretty much spot on. But there's a lot of ballot on demands that are printed at the actual voting centers, and those had large offsets.
Do we know how many ballots on demand there were or not? Is there any records of
So it would
those?
be roughly 168,000, which would be the election day ballots.
So those were
We
all
are
ballots
seeing-
on demand?
Yeah, we are seeing more than that where this offset occurred. And so we're trying to drill into what printers and where and what that's tied to.
Okay, thank you. Okay, continue. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
I think that was everything.
Okay.
to cover.
So let's go to, let me back up to the paper examination issue too. How do we verify, so Maricopa County is saying we only use 4 types of paper and they're all secure, and we're saying they're not. How do we prove that? What is the best way to get that documentation to say what the truth really is? Can you help me with that?
Yeah, certainly. We can request information on the purchasing of paper that was utilized for ballots, what their quantities were and where they were utilized. We can get information on what printers were utilized at different locations, and all of that can help tie together to make more sense out of the information we have.
Great, thank you. Would you be able to make a list of that for me so that we can try and ask for that information for you?
Yes, ma'am.
Welcome back, and in case you didn't catch that part near the end or catch the meaning of that part at the end, you just heard Doug Logan say that there were 168,000 ballots on hand, but there were more than 168,000 ballots that were misaligned. Now, what does that mean? As he was saying, as he just explained, and you just heard him say, that there are ballots that are created ahead of time by professional printers, and then there are ones that are run off on demand, quote unquote, on demand at the voting site. And it's perfectly reasonable to guess that the printers at the voting site would not be the same high quality as a professional printer. So it could be understandable that you would have all these ballots on demand that would not line up, that would have serious misalignment problems. But he says, again, there are more than 168,000 ballots on demand that are misaligned. So now we have to ask about those. We have to wonder where those misaligned ballots came from, because they could only come from 2 places: from the professional printers, in which case, how professional are they if they're screwing up these ballots? They should be able to print very precisely. If we're seeing this misalignment problems, that's got to be a pretty bad printer. And then the question would be which printer, and don't use that printer again. The only other conclusion is that some amateurs, some guy just ran off some Xerox copies, and they, you know, if you run it through your printer in your house, through an $80 printer, you're going to get your misalignment problems. But again, the auditors, they don't make any conclusions as to how something happened. They are being very fair, as I try to be, and they are just saying what happened, and it's up to the Senate to do an investigation, and the Arizona Senate, and determine what happened. That's not their job. They are just providing the facts. They are doing the audit, providing the conclusion, and what happens after that, it's up to the Arizona Senate.
let's go to what we call voter data analysis, and because this ties in directly with the canvassing, our contract, the Senate contract with you, and your proposal for work, one of those items was canvassing. To be able to actually verify if you found any information, and the only or best way to verify it is to actually go to that person. And I've always used the example because I do know of a case where one house got 25 ballots in the mail and only 2 people lived there. And so we had talked about how do we verify that, and there was a question about canvassing. Department of Justice sent us a letter about 4 or 6 weeks ago and said, we're concerned about you actually knocking on doors, that you might, might be voter intimidation or civil rights violation or something, which I find is interesting after the White House last week said we're going to knock on doors to see whether you're vaccinated or not. But that's a side point, just a little side point. But so we told the Department of Justice that we would postpone that indefinitely until your audit was at a point where we could even determine whether that was going to be necessary or not. So can you talk to us about that, and is it going to be necessary? Is it not? Go into that part for me, please.
Yeah, based on the data we're seeing, I highly recommend we do the canvassing because it's the one way to know for sure whether some of the data we're seeing, if it's real problems or whether it's clerical errors of some sort. So for example, we have 74,243 mail-in ballots where there is no clear record of them being sent. And just to be clear, here in the state of Arizona, there's EV32s and EV33s. EV32s is supposed to give a record of when a mail-in ballot is sent, and an EV33 is supposed to give a record of when the mail-in ballot is received. And so there should be an equal, there should be more EV32s, more sent out than there are that are received. Specifically with these, we can tie them to a specific individual that was mailed to. And so we have 74,000 where we have them came back from individuals where we don't have a clear indication that they were ever sent out to them. That could be something where documentation wasn't done right. There was a clerical issue. There's not proper things there. But I think when we've got 74,000, it merits knocking on a door and validating some of this information.
So, Madam President, if I may, Mr. Logan, what are you looking at where you see this, where there's 72,000 received but not 72,000 sent? What did you guys look at to come up with that?
So there was information that was FOIA'd from the county, specifically in these EV32 and EV34 or 33 forms. And that is what gives an account of what was sent out and what was received back.
This is the data you received from a FOIA request back from the county.
Members of our team received back, correct.
And you're saying that the EV33, which is the number of ballots received, was higher than the number of ballots.
We are not seeing an equivalent EV32 to go along with EV34. Or 33, I'm sorry, I keep doing this up.
32 and 33.
32 and 33, we're not seeing them where they match up because there should be a matchup of them. Obviously, you're going to have more mail-in ballots sent out than are ever returned, but specifically, these should match up with each other.
Okay.
That's actually the last thing I have to cover from this section.
Okay.
So we have also seen some interesting things related to the voter rolls. So for example, we have 11,326 people that did not show up on a November 7th version of the voter rolls that should have been after votes were cast, but then appeared on the December 4th voter rolls. And just be clear, they show as voted in this past election, but they were not a November 7th version of the file, and they did show up on the December 4th version.
Okay, that sounds confusing. Give me an explanation of why that might have, we're not saying there's fraud, we're not saying anything else. I'm just trying to find answers. Is there a logical explanation why that would be?
I cannot think of a logical explanation on what that would be, but it'd be a great thing to hear back from the county to see if there's anything that we're not thinking of.
Okay, thank you. Continue.
So we have, from what I understand here in Arizona, they originally Hobbs had requested that the registration date for voting be moved up to election day, and there was actually a court case that moved it back to October 15th. based on the registration information that we found in the voter rolls, we have 3,981 individuals who show as having voted in this election, and their data shows up in the canvas as having voted in this election. However, they were registered after October 15th.
So what we would need is, again, so all of these, Madam President, so all of these are things that canvassing, we could find out, did they register before, did they even vote? Or we need some more data, we need more data from the county to show they registered before that date, something showing that they registered before October 15th, or something showing that these, their ballots were sent out to people where they were received. Or we need to do a canvass. We need to be doing canvassing to ask the voters themselves.
Okay, continue.
The last one I have is we have roughly 20,000, I think it was about actually closer to 18,000, who voted in the election and then showed as being removed from the voter rolls soon after the election. So they were on the voter rolls, they showed as voted, and then they were removed. And there could be a good logical explanation for that, but it seems like a large number to immediately have after an election be removed. And so getting more documentation on the request to remove from voter rolls or other process to make sure that makes sense seems logical. In addition, again, knocking on doors and canvassing can help validate that information.
So now on to the envelope issue. Here is Doug Logan talking about the missing envelopes with, I believe, Ben Cotton jumping in at one point. So here's a discussion of that issue.
Envelopes, that's an issue that we've been talking about. Would you like to touch on that as well?
Yeah, we've had an affidavit that specifically stated that when mail-in ballots were received, that so many of them were received that the standards reduced over time. They originally talked about there was initially 20 points of comparison on the signature, and then after some time they're told to go to 10 points of signature, 10 points of comparison, then 5, and then eventually they were just told to let every single mail-in ballot through. So we think it's important. Understand with the course of our settlement, the only thing we can look at is blank signatures, but we think it's important to get the mail-in ballot images and see how many, if any, blank signatures came through, because that could have a material impact on the election.
Okay. Do we not have those images of the envelopes?
We do not have those images. Maricopa County has stated that they provided us with images of the envelopes, but specifically the folder they pulled into us on a specific drive has to do with voter registration details. It does not appear to have anything to do with the receiving of ballots. And I believe that, again, Bennett can tell you more about his interchanges with them, but specifically we asked them, so are you saying that in that folder we should have the envelopes that were utilized for ballots to be delivered in this past election? And the answer was basically there's envelopes in that folder, and it did not clearly answer our question.
So, Mr. Bennett, when you asked them or advised them that maybe they're mistaken, they're not here, could you send it again, or what was said?
I would simply recommend, Madam President, that they be re-subpoenaed as almost maybe a separate item and on a separate device, and it's not commingled with other folders or anything else.
I guess her question is, what has been their response when you asked we need the images of the ballots.
Envelopes.
We need the images of the envelopes that were mailed. They said they gave us a file. It's not on the file. When you ask, you tell them we don't have those. What is the response? What has the response been to you?
It's on the Lacey 5 terabyte hard drive in a affidavits folder that's 1.83 terabytes big. And we keep looking for it and don't find it.
If I might add, I did an extensive forensic search for the mail-in ballots. The only images that are contained on the referenced Lacey drive are the original voter registration affidavits. Nothing to do with mail-in ballots.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. So we will put that on the list of things to ask.
Welcome back, and now we get to the end. that list I promised you. Here is a list. Well, you already had the list much earlier from Ben Cotton of all of the things that the digital forensic auditors needed that Maricopa County is so far refusing to provide. Now here is Doug Logan's list. It's a long one. It's a long one, but here it is.
Is there anything that we haven't brought up that you would need to make this where you feel like it's a complete audit?
Yeah, so specifically when we talk about those changes to the voter rolls we talked about, and there's additional things we've seen that have changed in voter rolls over time that should not change. I think it would be very helpful if we could get a full backup copy of the database of voter rolls, specifically with information about who it was that made changes and when, and IP addresses and those details, so we can drill into why it is that some of these changes have taken place. I think we talked about chain of custody already. That's something that's extremely important for us to validate the chain of custody of everything from the point where the first ballot was sent to the point where we received stuff. We have full chain of custody of what we've covered, while it's been in our custody, but we need to know of it prior to that.
Okay.
So we understand that there may be some systems associated with the duplication of ballots that we have not forensically looked at. And as we've seen problems with duplication, if we're able to have access to those, we believe it would be very valuable in seeing what might be going on.
So what do you mean? What are you looking for there?
Well, there's some software, I believe it's called Novus, that's used as part of the duplication process. There was actually a court case, I believe it was Ward via Jackson, where it was discovered that some of that duplication was not properly attributing results for the candidate the original had. And so being able to forensically look at that information would be helpful. And based on some analysis that Mr. Cotton has done, he does not see that within any of the data sets that we currently have. And so the question is whether the original subpoena was worded as such that we should have received that, or whether this is something that needs to be in a new request.
Okay. Anything else?
So any reports associated with the breach that is known about of the voter rolls with Maricopa County, that again will help with investigation that Mr. Cotton is putting together.
To be clear, you're talking about the breach that happened in the Maricopa County, sent letters out to the voters and saying, please be aware our system's been hacked or breached, and
Yes, ma'am.
we believe none of your personal information has been disclosed. That letter, that breach.
Correct.
Okay.
There's been minimal public information available about that, and any internal reports on what was discovered, the levels of the breach, and how far would be very helpful in our analysis as to whether the voting systems were impacted this election cycle.
Now, you weren't here at the time. I don't know if you know, Mr. Bennett. Do you remember, is this the same breach as the one where the FBI raided that house?
Yes,
I don't know.
Doug
Yes,
is
ma'am, I
nodding.
believe so.
Mr. Logan, okay.
And, Mr. Cotton, I don't know if you want to chime in
I
on that.
believe that to be the same.
Okay, thank you.
So specifically, we'd like to request all portable media or external hard drives that contained election definitions, election results, backups, or similar data. We know from photos that we've seen from MTech that there was at least 3 orange drives, of which we received 1 of them. And reviewing the wording of the subpoena, portable media and external drives may not have been included if you were trying to take a very narrow view of what we requested. We believe there will be backups and other information that will be helpful in our analysis on those.
Okay.
So you need us to subpoena the 2 missing orange drives? Missing
Well,
drives?
I think we
Or any
worded it
any portable
as any
drives.
portable media or external drives that have not been given prior subpoenas.
Okay, thank
They're
you.
associated with elections specifically.
Thank you.
We don't need any of the information we've already seen, so most of this stuff we've put caveats that we don't need things we already received. As we've heard the report that the election department shares a network with the sheriff's department, it'd be very helpful to have the network diagram to show how that is, and from our analysis standpoint, it will make it easier for Mr. Cotton to hone in on what happened, and again, to look at things. I think we already talked about the backups of election management data. Digital copies of all versions of policies and procedures utilized associated with the election would be helpful. We've received verbal reports from a number of people that work for Maricopa County that indicate that some of the things we've seen don't actually comply with Maricopa County's policies and procedures, but without a copy of those, it's difficult for us to validate those. And we want to make sure that any finding we put into our report is something that be irrefutable, and we have the hard evidence to back it up. So getting those policies and procedures would be helpful in doing so.
Question, if I might. Question. Why would those not be public record and already produced somewhere? If they're procedures, election procedures.
Well, some levels of them are public and are available. But when I looked into specifically trying to see some of the ballot storage requirements and how they should be stored specifically as an example, there was not very detailed information. And usually you have guidance from a state, and then within a county they'll have very specific their interpretation of how they execute it. It's one of the reasons why it's so valuable with an audit to be able to have conversations with people, because there's things they do in Maricopa County they don't do that way anywhere else in the country. And not all those are necessarily wrong. It's not about right or wrong, it's just different. So getting their policies and procedures so we know them and we're aware of them is something that's helpful. And some of that information they did send over with the original subpoenas, but there's additional, like I said, when I went through them, there's enough things that we ran through that I couldn't find specific documentation on that we were told they had specific guidance on, and we'd like copies of that.
Okay, so so through inferences, they're told they know how to do this. Well, how do we know how to do this? It's not in the procedure manuals. We need where they're getting this guidance and training.
Correct.
Okay.
And most governmental organizations have very clear and very precise policies and procedures for pretty much everything that's done. And so it should be something that's easy to procure. So we mentioned before about the blue sheets. Since we received these through another party, we'd like to specifically subpoena them so we know we have the official copies of them. They call them the tabulation logs. That was the official name that they utilized in them. And so that's, again, just to make sure that what we have is valid and real. We have no reason to expect that it's not, but it's just good to get it officially. Tied in with some of the things we ran into on the voter rolls, records of all mailed out ballots, everything that's available as far as what's mailed out and what was rejected, and validation that they were destroyed if they were rejected and came back. I've got a lot of things in here. They're specific to that, but for the brevity, So we'd like copies of all files transmitted for the purpose of duplicating damaged ballots or alternate format ballots, specifically to help us trace some of this information to make sure everything matches up and that it followed appropriately, because for things to be printed by a printer at Runbeck on duplicate ballots, they had to send a request over to them of some format and some data, and we'd like to be able to match that up with everything that we have. And we talked about the records of all paper distributed to vote centers and so forth. So additional information associated with adjudication of ballots would be helpful as we do our analysis on those and make sure that conforms with expectations. The votes were cast over as far as what the process was, who was involved in it, and how they validated things with that. Specifically, we'd like information about the total count of all ballots sent to UOCAVA eligible voters, how they were sent and how they were received, because there's a number of different ways those votes can be received back. And we have some of the numbers with UOCAVA seem a little off, seem a little anomalous, and we'd like to get more documentation on that to make sure that we can have, if there's any anomalies that merit going into a report, that we have the information to know whether it belongs or doesn't. I think that's pretty much everything here. If we're talking about things generically, there's more specifics that I have listed, but.
Okay.
Welcome back, and now just a short summation of everything you've seen today. There was a lot of it, and I'm going to let Kelly Ward give you the summation. Kelly Ward, Dr. Kelly Ward, who, unlike Jill Biden, by the way, is an actual medical doctor, not somebody who got an education degree and insists on being called doctor. She's a real doctor. And here she is pretty much summing up everything that you've seen. So here's Kelly.
Hello, Arizona. It is time for the daily update from the Republican Party of Arizona. I am your chairwoman, Dr. Kelly Ward. Like many of you, I watched the Arizona State Senate hearing today on the current status of the full forensic audit of the Maricopa County 2020 general election, or as we like to call it, America's audit. I want to thank Senate President Karen Fann and Senate Judiciary Chairman Warren Peterson for conducting really such a professional hearing. The audit team shared a lot of new information, including that thousands of duplicated ballots, these are the ballots that are duplicated because of damage to the original ballot or some other problem, did not have a serial number as required by state statutes, as required by law. Without those serial numbers, it is impossible to match the original ballot to the duplicate. That's a real problem. Bob Cotton, a court-recognized forensic data expert, stated that the Maricopa election system had not and has not been updated with security updates since August of 2019. August of 2019 is when the Dominion software was originally loaded on those machines. So just so you know, your personal computer is probably more secure than the county voting systems because there have been many security updates to Windows systems since that time due to security vulnerabilities. Also, the administrator passwords to the election management system, EMS, were all the same and were not changed since August of 2019. In other words, everyone accessing those machines used the same weak password. Those are major violations of industry standard cybersecurity protocols. We also learned that according to the written records, there were about 74,000 mail-in ballots that were received by the county, but there is no record that they were ever sent out. A clerical error? Who knows? The county won't answer. There were also nearly 4,000 people who were shown as having voted on Election Day, but their registration date is after October 15th, 2020, which was the deadline for registering to vote. 18,000 people voted in the election, but very shortly after the election, they were purged from the county's voter rolls. Why? We don't know. The county won't answer. There are still many materials that have not been provided to the audit team to conduct a complete and full forensic audit. They were subpoenaed, they haven't been provided. It includes the routers, the Splunk logs, which show who accessed county systems when and how, and images of the mail-in ballot envelopes to check the signatures. The senators indicated they are preparing additional subpoenas for those materials if needed, and also any information of the publicly acknowledged cyber breach of the Maricopa County system that happened last fall. Whew. This matter is far from over, and let me assure you that here at the Republican Party of Arizona, we will continue to support the audit, and we will not take our eye off the ball. I live tweeted the hearing, and you can find that summary at Kelly Ward AZ on Twitter and Getter. Kelly with an I care about the people. And remember this, here at the Republican Party of Arizona, it is always election integrity and always America first. I'll see you next time.
Welcome back, and that's it for today, except to once again invite. Welcome back, and that's it for today, except to invite Scott and our other liberal friends to join with me and demand that Maricopa County, the election officials, turn over all the information, all the devices, all the passwords that they are withholding from the auditors that would allow them to complete their audit. And one thing everybody could do if you stuck around through this whole vlog is give me a thumbs up if you like this video, share with anybody you think would also like it. Got any comments? Comment section below the video, or you can put questions, suggestions for future topics. You could visit my other channels, my hot dog recipe channel, my original music channel. You could subscribe. I love getting new subscribers. But most of all, I appreciate the time you spent with me. I especially appreciate the time you spent with me today, if you spent all that time with me. And well, just think of poor little me recording this whole thing and then editing it and inserting, cutting out those excerpts and inserting them. So I hope you get something out of all the work I put into this, and that you'll come back and see me again. I look forward to seeing all of you again. And until I do see all of you again, bye.